presentation, Drug-Free Pain Management, presented by Mitchell Perry. Mitch is going to deliver an entertaining and possibly life-changing talk on pain relief and healing without drugs, drawing on his success with personal pain issues and client experiences. He will also discuss ways to overcome undesirable habits. By following ancient and modern practices of guided visualization, Mitch has been helping people learn to work together with their inner MD to potentiate healing, reduce pain, and improve their lives. Since being credentialed in 1989 as a clinical hypnotherapist in California, he has been 3 years president of the International Association of Counselors and Therapists and has maintained an educational and therapeutic practice in California and Lakeside. So he's going to be with us next week. Today's meditation leader is David Warren.
Good morning, everyone. This morning I'd like to get tuned on this set of bagpipes, both of which have a story that I'd like to share with you. Back on the 29th of December 2015, a very dear friend of mine died in Canada. And I asked the family if I could create a living memorial for him. I asked to have his set of bagpipes. This is that set of bagpipes which have been completely refinished and refurbished to make a beautiful instrument with a wonderful tone. The family delayed his memorial service until I returned and had the pipes restored. And at that service, I played on his set of bagpipes his favorite tune, and that is the Dark Isles. And today I'd like to play that tune for you. So I just ask you to get very comfortable in your chair. If you'd like to focus your concentration, then just close your eyes and let the music wash over you as you think about persons that have gone that were important in your life.
This week's presentation, the International Populist Movement and How It Impacts Investment Markets, presented by Yann Kostic and Tom Zachystal. From London to Washington to Paris, the populist movement is creating profound shifts in governing philosophies. In the old days, when people revolted against the government, there was often bloodshed. Recently is more likely to mean a surprising change in leadership with radical changes in policies and direction. The recent US presidential election, Brexit in the UK, the popularity of Marine Le Pen in France are completely reshaping the beginning of this 21st century and the world map. Where are we headed? What are the short and long-term consequences for investment markets and your portfolio? Tom is president of Individual Asset Management, Atlantis Wealth Management, as well as president of the San Francisco Financial Planner Association. Yann is president of Atlantis Wealth Management. Both are registered investment advisors. Please welcome them.
Well, I tell you what, it's hard to follow those bagpipes, I have to say. But I want to thank Open Circle and Kat for having us back again this year. We were here about this time last year, and we talked about behavioral finance. How many people were here last year? How many people saw us? Oh, right, okay. So actually a lot of people didn't see us. Oh, good, no wonder. I guess there's a lot of churn after we speak once. But anyway, thanks for coming out. I mean, last year was kind of a fun topic. We did a lot of audience participation. This year it's a little more serious, I guess. We're going to be talking about populism, but let me sort of explain what we're going to be talking about, what we're not going to be talking about. So in keeping with the format of Open Circle, we're not going to be talking about stocks and bonds and individual investments and where you should invest. If you want to hear more about that, we're doing 2 other seminars this week, one here on Tuesday at 10 o'clock, I think. And well, this is going to be more of a philosophical type conversation about populism in the States, but globally. Neither Yann nor I are political scientists or anything like that, but we do follow it in sense of investment markets and on behalf of our clients and where we should invest. And so that's kind of where it's going to be oriented. But it's important to kind of get the background of it and sort of have a conversation on what's going on and in the States and different parts of the world. And that's more what we're going to be focused on. And we are going to talk a little bit about the investment themes towards the end of it as well, and then there's going to be a Q&A. The one thing we don't want to get into is, there's a lot of emotions. I live in San Francisco. There's a lot of emotions about the election, especially in politics in the States, and so we want to keep it on a civilized tone here, and then have more of a philosophical discussion, I think, right? So, getting started, I guess, and. Everybody knows about the election in the States, right, and Donald Trump, and it was a surprise for many, not for everybody, but it isn't just about that. I mean, before there was Trump, there was Brexit, right? There was Nigel Farage in the UK, and he was the head of what they call UKIP, the Independence Party there, that sort of started the movement for Great Britain, for the United Kingdom to leave the EU, which is now entering its final phase, I guess you could say that, although it'll play out over at least 2 years, probably more. So there's him, there's the UKIP, and there's the elections in Holland. We just had elections in Holland. There's a fellow there by the name of Count Wilders. I probably butchered that, but interestingly enough, he has a pretty wild hairdo as well, so maybe that's part of it. But he also was sort of what you would call the far right, the populist movement. And he wasn't elected, but what it did was it brought sort of everybody to the right. The man who was elected had to step to the right to get elected in Holland. And then we have French elections coming up in about a month. Marine Le Pen is also far right, a Trump fan as well. And we had elections in Austria, I think last year, and there was a populist movement there as well, which again didn't win. But again, the parties everybody kind of took a step to the right, if you want to call it that. And so let's get a little bit of a historical perspective, first of all, because populism isn't something that's new, although it seems to flare up from time to time, if you want to look at it that way. And I think that's what Yann's going to start talking about.
Yes, it all started way back when in Paris, beautiful Paris, with the French Revolution. And it was so romantic at the time that if you didn't agree, if you decided for any reason, you could lose your head over it. Ask King Louis. He did not end up well. And what the French did is basically look at a situation that was dire for many, many reasons. It didn't happen overnight. Populism in France basically started because the government made a lot of mistakes. King Louis sent his best troop, you may remember the name Lafayette, all the way to the United States, to the new colonies, to get rid of the Brits. So along with that, he sent a lot of money. What happened in the meantime is the French invented about a decade before what's called the French kiss, that you're all familiar with. The effect of the French kiss, about 10, 15 years later, French population had exploded by about 40%. And you have to feed all those people. And that's the problem, you have to feed all those people. The baguette is great, but at the same time, we had floods, we had droughts, and we had terrible weather. The global warming was already happening 200 years ago, and the price of the baguette went through the roof. Also, at the time, we had fake news, because it's not true. Marie Antoinette never, ever said, let them have cake. That never happened. Never. But there was a guy that worked at this French CNN at the time that did say, no, his name was Marat. He ended up badly. He was killed in his bathtub by a girl from Brittany that said enough of the violence, and she stabbed him. But the guy was calling on a daily basis with the newspaper in Paris called L'Ami du Peuple, the friend of the people, calling for the head of this one or this one, and it changed pretty much all the time. But make no mistake about it, the French Revolution was an atrocious, horrible event. Even though it brought, no, it was not a game changer, it was a system changer. If you look at it, after the French Revolution, a lot of things happened in Europe that led to World War I, World War II. So it really, you know, from the price of the baguette having such importance, and the French dish, let's not forget that. So overall, what happened was there was a financial crisis made by the government. They tried to fix it, but they couldn't. It led to a major change, and people were, about 100,000 people died, like guillotine. So at the end, it wasn't a very good thing for people in power. And who would have thought that the people could rise and change their government? That was the first, I mean, in modern history, that was the first time they killed their kings, king and queen, by the way. So if we think about this for a moment, that's what populism was then. That's what happened. Now, this is the same type of movement. So it's bringing changes that are enormous. Now, I know that right now it's done every morning by tweets or by executive orders, but those are big changes. That's not really how you run a country unless the system is changing and we're not realizing it. And that, I think, is very important. Wilders in Holland, well, it's important. He didn't win, but he nearly doubled his votes. And now the government, which is kind of the same, has to include him. And he's as far right as Marine Le Pen. Marine Le Pen election is going to be next month. She's as radical as the Brits as far as Brexit, as we're talking about the French. And well, she has the same plan. She wants to kick out the euro, get out of Europe. Well, that has a lot of implications for the future and for investments as well. What does happen with just Germany as the leader of Europe? So all of these are very, very serious changes. And as we'll talk about later, sometimes people make decisions of voting on one issue. They don't look at all the rest. Say, well, there's that one issue, and I'm going to vote for that person because of that one issue. But they don't see the consequences of those changes. Now, I cannot read anything here, but this, for the new people that are here, look at this weather. This is fantastic. You don't have that up north. Minnesota? No. Toronto? No. Anyhow, the story that the French never really cared too much for the Brits. That was pre-Beatles time, after Zelda and pre-Beatles. So that's why the king spent all that money, all that effort to support. Is that proxy war, something that we use, nowadays? But it was the beginning of the situation was a bad economic situation, in which instead of making the right decisions, the government of the time made the wrong decisions and took the wrong steps. Now it worked for the United States; it became independent. That's why independence these days in England don't like that word too much. But still, they voted for it. And why? They voted for it because of immigration, which is right now in Europe a key element. You have all this immigration coming from North Africa, which has been a problem for 40 years, but not all the refugees from Syria are floating all over Europe. as we may sadly remember the events of in Paris, in the Bataclan, in the concert hall, but also the truck in Nice last year, the people of Europe have really segmented into two parts. The pro-immigration and the one that don't want immigration. Brexit was voted on that one and only topic, immigration. You asked about many British friends, Scottish friends, they didn't want to leave Europe, but they didn't want any more immigration. And that's why nearly 1 or 3 people in France don't want any more immigration, because they put everybody in the same bag, if you will. We said, no, we have enough of this. We don't want for safety, for security. And of course, the politicians, they do it pretty much well. We don't build walls in Europe. We killed the last one in Berlin a few years ago. But that wall being built overnight, pretty much in a week, when it was torn down, again, changed the politics. And the wall just became, more than anything else, a symbol. I've got a lot of Mexican friends that called the gentleman in the White House the king of walls. And what I hear is they don't want to build walls, they want to build friendships, which really makes a whole lot sense. But if that wall is going to be finally built, companies like Cemex here, or another French company, La Paire, who are the kings of the cement companies in the world, are meant to make a lot of money that wall is built, which is another situation. Anyway, next part.
Well, let's, so having started with the French Revolution, don't worry, we're not going to run through the rest of history here, but there are plenty of other examples of where populism has sort of come to the fore. And you know, a little bit about my background. I was born in Prague. I grew up in Canada, in Edmonton. I've been in the States since '99, but I'm an engineer by education, and I worked in the oil business for 10 years for a company called Schlumberger. I worked internationally in a number of places, Nigeria, Holland, Middle East, Southeast Asia. And one of the places I worked in was Indonesia. And I was there in 1998, where they had a big populist uprising, if you want to call it that. It was the end of what they called the Suharto regime there. And essentially what happened, and why this is kind of important and almost a parallel, is that, I mean, it was a really bloody time. What happened was there were, well, frankly, there was an ethnic aspect to it, because there were a lot of Chinese business people. They had more money than the Indonesians in general. They were thought to have influence with the government, and the Indonesians were very nice people most of the time. You know, started slaughtering the Chinese and raiding their businesses and so on. All of a sudden there was, I recall the Chinese were all huddled at the airport because it was the only place where they could be protected. Plus they wanted to get out of the country. But what prompted that, and it wasn't really about the Chinese there, it was more about the government and the fact that Indonesia had gone through a period of prosperity, and then we had the Asian financial crisis, which was in '87. And all of a sudden, there was, you know, the bottom fell out of the economy, basically, and there wasn't enough food for some people. The government was thought to be corrupt. Everybody wanted a change. You know, how often do you hear that word change? And that's what kind of prompted that movement. And it just, interestingly enough, I remember I flew in, and it was, I guess, sometime in '98. And I was taking a taxi to my hotel, and the big hotels are kind of in the central square, which is just in front of, you know, whatever the parliament buildings or whatever they call them, and all the students were protesting in this square, and I was in a taxi and going through this crowd, right, and people had to park to let us through, and I was getting a little nervous, right, but amazingly, these were mostly young people, students protesting, and they'd look in the car and they'd see me, a Western guy, and they'd just say, you know, they just wave, hi, how you doing? You're not our problem, kind of thing, right? So, so it was an interesting time there, and again, it was the kind of thing where you get this change, you get this upheaval when you get into a situation where you have this big disparity between the haves and the have-nots, which we talk a lot about in the U.S. now. Or just all of a sudden you get a situation where people can't get jobs, maybe they don't have food if it's really extreme, that kind of a thing, and that's when it happens, right? And it kind of makes sense. But what we see happening in the States, and again, I live in the Bay Area, so we see a lot of this. There's a pretty huge economic divide just in that area between the people that work in technology, for example, and practically everybody else. And so what we see, I mean, to give you an idea, so my wife works for Apple, and they're having a hard time hiring people, and they've got to pay them big bucks. Well, first of all, it's expensive to live in that area, but even so, just to get the people in the competition between Google and Apple and Amazon and all these others for computer programmers. So there's these high salaries there, and then there's the other side of the equation, right? And you look at the perks they pay them, it's amazing. I tried to hire someone for my financial advisory business, and they started asking me, you know, a young person, and they started asking me, well, do you have a barista? I mean, do you have massages? Do you provide bus service to the office? Apple and Google, they're doing all this stuff, right? And so the competition is intense for those kinds of jobs. But then I also noticed that when we get the newspaper in the morning, it's delivered by an adult in a truck. And I remember when I was a kid, I had a paper route, right? It used to be a kid's job to deliver the newspaper, right? And now it isn't. Or when I was a kid, you worked at McDonald's, or you worked at the theater, or you worked at the car wash, and it was a part-time job for you to earn some bucks in the summertime, or maybe you were trying to fund a college education or something. And now those jobs are done by people who need to support families. And that also has changed, right? So that's where the disparity is. And why is this? You know, we can ask ourselves why this is. I mean, why aren't there all of these middle-class jobs that there used to be? But think about what these middle-class jobs used to be, right? Bank tellers. Has anyone used a bank teller lately? I mean, maybe down here you use more, I don't know, but most people go to an ATM these days, right? Back in the day, we had switchboard operators. Now it's all electronic switchboards, right? For the phones and so on. There's plenty of other examples of that. I mean, even last time when we cut back on immigration, which I think was during the Bush era, so we managed to stop more people coming over the borders to work in the farms in California, for example. And the thought was that, well, okay, Americans would take those jobs, but that didn't happen. What happened was mechanization. People just got machines to do the jobs instead. And those jobs never came back, right? So this kind of a thing is, and there's plenty of other examples, right? I mean, you've got a few examples you mentioned too.
Yeah, I didn't say what I presented. I didn't present myself. I should have. I was born in Paris and moved to the United States for further my studies. Got a master's degree in finance in Florida. Nice place to have a master's degree. Still much better than Minnesota. Worked for the local company at the time was Disney.
You know, I just got to say, if you're from Edmonton, Minnesota's not such a bad place. We used to have the biggest mall in the world, and they built a bigger one.
So I worked at Disney as a tour guide, wearing something like this, and quite a lot of people. Of course, I spoke French, so that helped with the French tourists. Nowadays, you just put something on your ear, done by computers. If you've been to NASA, Cape Canaveral, Cape Kennedy, there's no more tour guides. It doesn't exist. It was a great job at the time as a student, getting paid $20 an hour to do that. In the 80s, couldn't ask for a better gig. Doesn't exist anymore. I moved from Florida, I went to California and to Texas, all great states. But it's true, things have changed drastically. When we first, 20 years ago, 30 years ago now, 20 years ago, entering orders by hand to buy under that old clunky system, 100 shares of a company, of IBM at the time, was quite a decision. Buy 100 shares, and it takes forever, and it costed a fortune too. The trades at the time were a fortune. 10 years ago, 20%, 25% of the trading was done by computers. Today, we're over 75%. If you still trade at home and do things on your own, most likely whoever's buying in front of you is not a who, that's a computer. And they're buying 10,000 times per second. So that's completely changed what the middle class is talking about. There's still plenty of them around, but it's not the way it used to be. You don't need an office of 100 people. You need an office with 5 or 6 and a bunch of computers. So that has changed tremendously. And the new prediction now, I was listening to Jeff Bezos from Amazon company, and now they've built those huge warehouses. Then you have to go get the stuff. Well, they're working with drones. The drones will get the stuff, Now, the limitation is 10 kilos, so they still cannot put me around. But the companies in Norway now, they're working at 100 kilos, meaning about 220 pounds. They say within 2 years, they can take me anywhere I want. Great. And they're solar powered. So pretty much expect your Domino's pizza to come into your house 10 minutes after you order it, wherever you are, and you won't have an interaction with the human. 2 years. So things are changing. In a couple of years, there's a Domino's pizza here, so in Mexico, maybe in 4 years you can order it and you'll have it. So no more that the kid from college delivering and that's it. No, you don't tip drones. So things are really changing so fast. And Elon Musk from Tesla, you know, the electric cars, 5, 6 years ago, people were believing that you had those cars. Now they're talking, especially in your state over there, nobody will drive anymore. What will happen? You're going to have somebody that drives, or somebody, the computer will drive your car. So I'll put it on all those lawyers, you know, looking for all those guys that get pulled over. All those lawyers, then this is a huge industry in the United States. So all those people, they're going to have to do something else. Now, it's not that easy to reconvert when you're 40, 45, let alone 50. So this is what will reshape the economy. And now that middle class is being again squeezed. So comparing with what happened with the French Revolution, there was a middle class that was getting squeezed. But some of us decided to move down here and, you know, have a beautiful life for 30% or 40 or 50% less. And that's still a possibility. But I don't see half of the states moving down here. That's not going to happen. So the problem is back in the United States as, yes, as he was mentioning, there's great jobs in California in which you're 25, you're getting paid 100 grand a year, and a masseuse. I'd sign up for that in a heartbeat. But those are very few jobs. Most of the middle class jobs are gone. And I tend to disagree with the current president that he's not going to be able to bring those jobs back. The jobs that will be brought back to the United States are pretty much the management people that will manage all those computer systems with completely automated factory. Look at the cars the Japanese did in the 80s. All those factories, when they build all those beautiful cars, it's automatic. So he's going to say, going to bring, you know, factories to bring back trucks. I don't know where those thousands of jobs are going to come from, but I don't think they're going to be building cars. Anyway.
Yeah, so it's hard to imagine what might go forward, but we've been in this situation before. I mean, when the assembly line was invented, for example, when you know, the steam power came into industrialization and that kind of thing. And so it strikes me as a similar kind of upheaval in that you have this, you may end up with a lost generation. These people who can't adapt to, I mean, you can't train somebody who's a coal miner to work as a computer technician all of a sudden. But the fact is that maybe the next generation will see where the opportunities lie, and hopefully there will be some jobs that they can latch on there. But I think it's going to be tough. But let's kind of get into what's happening now here and in Europe, and how that leads us to maybe some kind of an investment perspective on this a little bit. And what's going on now is, so let's talk a little bit about Brexit. So what happened in the UK? And basically, as probably most of you know, there was a vote. There was a party called the UK Independence Party that led the charge to take Great Britain out of the EU, right? And so that passed by a narrow vote, much to a lot of people's surprise. It did pass. It passed mostly on the basis of immigration policy. But in any case, just now, we went through sort of a parliamentary step in the meantime, and just now it's been announced that they've entered this 2-year process of exiting the EU, and now there's going to be a negotiation on how exactly that's going to work, because you know the remaining members of the EU they don't want to see anybody else leave, so they're probably going to take a little bit of a hard line on this, and at the same time the UK wants to get as good a deal as they can, but they're not going to have their cake and eat it too either. So one of the things they're talking about, for example, that has already been raised, and that, by the way, the UK Independence Party didn't mention as an issue before, is the fact that the EU has this debt that is owed by the UK, or they say they have this debt that is owed, because there's a 7-year plan that all these countries commit to, and there's funding associated with that, and it's somewhere between 25 and 70 billion dollars that the UK should owe for that 7-year funding. But now they're not going to be around for those 7 years. So should they pay? Shouldn't they? That's going to be a negotiation. There's going to be a negotiation about trade deals, that kind of a thing. So I think they'll be lucky to get this done in 2 years, which is kind of the time limit that's been imposed. And then there's a further complication to that in that the people in Scotland voted to stay in the EU by and large. And then last year there was a vote on Scottish independence from Great Britain, which they voted to stay in. But now you kind of wonder whether they want to have another vote on that, and it could end up that Scotland separates from, England and joins the EU, stays in the EU. So that could happen as well. So it could end up being a disintegration in the UK rather than in Europe. But then there's also the possibility of other EU countries exiting. If Marine Le Pen gets elected in France, which people think that probably not, but in any case, if she does, then one of her ideas is that France should exit. And if France exits, well, France was the original country that kind of got this whole thing going. So if they exit, it's over, basically, right? So that's something dramatic that could happen. Probably won't, because we didn't see Austria go that way. We didn't see Holland go that way. Probably will not see France go that way, but you never know. It could happen. And so but even if it doesn't happen, things are getting more extreme in Europe, a step to the right, right? And so that's kind of what's going on there. And there's some implications for investment markets, stocks, bonds, that kind of a thing, both there and here, and that's what we're going to talk about now. And it's interestingly, Yann and I have a little bit of a different opinion on this, so there you go. I'll let you go first.
Yeah. What I think is interesting is to think of somebody else. It's their problem, it's Europe, unless of course you're from there. But as Americans, as Canadians, we look at Europe and say, well, this is what they're doing. But let's go back for a second here in the United States. Now, I know it's not been 100 days, and you've got to give the guy a chance to do what he's supposed to do. But it seems like he's not being able to rally all the Republicans. And, well, the Democrats are not helping, I understand them. But the Republicans are not helping either. And everything was supposed to be done so fast. I've got one of my clients that voted for Trump and said, this business guy, I don't care what he did, what he said, even when all the drama unfolded during the pre-election phase, the campaign. He said, I don't care. He's a business guy. I'm tired of all those politicians, right, left, middle. I want somebody that's going to get the job done. He's going to shake up Congress, and finally, we're going to move forward. And I think that's what the vast majority of people that voted for Trump, they wanted something that was going to change. Not the usual story with Congress. Congress approval last year was like 15%. You're not happy. The middle class is not happy. They want to change. They got Trump. But what I'm seeing from maybe a different angle and perspective, well, what is important, while the stock market has rallied like it did, and I'm sure if you have portfolios in the stock market, you're very happy. Whether you're from the right, the left, or the center. Stocks went up 20%, pretty much. In anticipation that the tax rate was going to change. Anticipation that all those regulations that are useless or that are considered by the groups that will eradicate them, not good for the economy or not good for jobs. But right now the White House is bogged down with a lot of tweets in the morning, the reaction in the afternoon, but we're nowhere near fixing the current problem. They cannot go to the tax rate if Obamacare is not fixed. Whether you agree or you disagree, the problem is not solved, and it's nowhere from being solved, from what I can tell. If Republicans have control, have complete control, and they cannot come together to put Obamacare, how long is it going to take? No, I'm not talking about the immigration. I'm sure you all follow living in Mexico. I'm sure you followed the story. Again, not for or against. It is not happening. They're not fixing the problem. They're not coming together. So I think a lot of people are disappointed at this very moment because things are not being fixed. Correct me if I'm wrong. Tell me one thing that has been fixed in this first, 50 days?
No, nothing.
I wish for the guy to be able to fix whatever needs to be fixed, because I want him to fix the taxes and fix, because I want the stock market to keep on going higher. Right? I mean, if you have investment, you agree with that. Now, the stock market has anticipated all that. Now, what's happening? From my point of view, in which we may disagree, is I think the American people will give them another summer. Congress will go on vacation as usual, and when they reconvene, hopefully things will get done fast. That's 4 or 5 months, 6 months down the road. So third quarter, we expect to have answers to see getting things done. If that doesn't happen in the third quarter, especially the months where stocks are not doing so well, generally September, October, which are the worst months for stocks. You know, summer is pretty quiet, people are on vacation. If that doesn't happen by that time, I think the stock market will not stay where it's at. Why? Because all of the anticipation of the good things that were promised, that should be happening, again, the Republicans are in control. Whichever group is in control should make things happen. Right this very moment, it is not happening. And I don't see it happening anytime soon. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. I do hope it happens soon. So I think the stock market has done well, but I think if things don't get solved, and especially with Congress right in the middle, I think we will have issues in September and October. But there's another view.
Well, my view is entirely different, but you know, I think that at the end of the day, I focus more on the economic aspect of it, right? And politicians come and go, politics come and go. Ultimately, I think what drives investment markets is the economy, the level of interest rates, financial metrics, that kind of a thing. Having said that, there are some investment opportunities brought in by the Trump card, if you want to call it that. For example, he's talking about less regulation, doing away with what we call the Dodd-Frank Act, which came out after in 2008 to add regulation to the banks, essentially other financial institutions. If he does manage to do away with that, or a large part of it, that should in theory be good for bank profits, for example, right? He's talking about gutting the Environmental Protection Agency. Well, you might think that oil companies or pipeline companies would benefit from something like that, and maybe the rest of us would lose. But anyway, things like that are things that you could maybe make some investment decisions on the basis of that. But like Yann said, we haven't really seen this play out yet. I mean, so far it's been mostly talk, and it's only been a short period of time too. It's hard to get everything he wants to get done in the first 50 days, but it'll depend on whether he has success or not in doing this. But my view is that, yeah, you can try to take a bet on these things, but there's two problems with that. First of all, the stock market tends to anticipate things. And so, for example, banks are the best performing sector, I think, since the election, on anticipation of less regulation in that industry. And so a lot of this has already been baked in by this big rise in the market that we've seen since the election. So, you know, you got to think about, well, is there still something left to bet on? But the other card that could be played, for example, is we're talking about lower tax rates, especially on the corporate side, and a lower tax, or maybe even no tax on what we call repatriating profits. So companies like Apple and Google, they make a lot of money outside the U.S. They have to keep that money there, because if they bring it back, they get taxed on it at a fairly high rate. So Apple has something like $300 billion, 95% of their cash parked offshore, and they don't want to bring it back because they're just waiting for somebody to change the tax code, and now it might actually happen. So if all that money comes back, you know, people say, well, it's just going to go to the rich, the people that own Apple stock. But even if it does, even if it goes to those people in the form of dividends, and I think some of it would be reinvested in the States, but even if it goes to those people, it still trickles down into the economy, and it's generally a good thing. It would certainly be a good thing for Apple stock, right? So things like that, you can bet on it, but what I look at more is the economy and where we're at, and frankly what I see there is that I think we've entered sort of the last cycle of what we call the up cycle. You know, you get into this sort of economic cycle where you have a recession, everybody's scared, nobody wants to invest, and they kind of get over it in time, the market goes up, and then you get into this hopeful thing, and then the last stage is kind of the bandwagon stage where everybody jumps on and maybe the market goes up very fast, and we saw this during the tech tech boom and during the real estate boom in 2007 and so on. And then you get to the top and you know, we have a recession or something like that. And generally that's accompanied by higher interest rates. Interest rates have started going up in the States now, but they're still very low. And generally that's a period of time where we have maybe a couple of years, 3 years of decent growth, maybe even a big boom in the stock market at some point. And then we get into this recession. And what I look at are what are called leading indicators. And there's about a dozen of these. The stock market is one of them. So if you're investing in the stock market, you're looking at the leading indicators, it's kind of like you're doing two things at the same time. But if you look at all the leading indicators together and you see where they turn, then maybe you don't get out at the top, but you get out, you know, a couple of months afterwards, and you kind of change the portfolio there. And so what I would say is, what I would expect is interest rates will start to rise slowly. Probably will do okay. You know, there will be peaks and valleys, but probably will do okay for the next few years, barring a war with North Korea or something. And then we'll have another recession, or there will be some event that will trigger the next recession. And at that point, hopefully, interest rates will be high enough that we'll be able to invest in bonds, and then interest rates will come up and we'll make some money in bonds. So that's kind of the way I look at it. But I do agree with Yann that it's still kind of too soon to tell. You know, it's only been 50 days, and it's hard to make these bets. And Q3, Q4 is really the time when it's going to start to pay out.
I think we wish Congress would work as well as we both work together. We don't agree all the time, but we find first we work on what we agree upon. And yes, there's a discrepancy, and what I guess our best advice to you is to keep things always well diversified. The only free lunch on Wall Street is diversification. And now we're not talking, you know, small cap, mid cap, large cap in the US, in technology. That's not being diversified. You want to be diversified across markets, North America, South America, Europe. You want to be diversified in different currencies. I'm sure you've seen the past 4 months what has happened to the pesos. 1907, I think it was Friday. You want to be investing in different currencies, and even if you don't have, you know, hundreds and hundreds, you can be very careful by the way you plan how you're going to exchange your pesos for your living needs down here. You want also to take into consideration what governments will do, because there may be a huge upheaval if nothing happens by the end of the year. Hopefully not like the French Revolution. I don't see anything like that, but there may be, people will not be happy, and I think they will want to be heard by Congress if nothing gets done. So again, the advice would be stay very close in touch with your advisor. Never ever you know, wonder. Ask questions, ask more questions, and if you're not happy, ask even more questions. You should know what your advisor thinks, or your team of advisors, even better, and get something. Balancing a budget is not easy. That's the US government. Balancing your budget is not easy. Balancing your portfolio is extremely important at this stage of your life, and so always get in touch with the people that manage your money, and if you manage your money yourself, well, congratulations. But be mindful of what will happen. The stock market, in my opinion, is ahead of itself, and can keep on higher. Can always do that, but make sure that you're protected and you know what you're doing. And if you don't, you get professional advice. Thank you so much for your time. Unless you have something to add.
Well, no, I think we're gonna open that up for questions. Do we have a few minutes, Kath? Or yeah. But let me just end with this. People are wondering what might happen politically and economically, and a lot of people are comparing Donald Trump to Andrew Jackson, right? One of our presidents back in 1828, who was really the first. A lot of people say the first populist president in politics because he was from Tennessee, and previously all the presidents have been from the East Coast, right? And what happened there was that, well, he went through his term, and then it was his vice president, Martin Van Buren, who got elected, and he kind of continued. But then there was basically a recession, or a depression, in fact, that follows, and that changed the political environment and the party. And so that's my view, that the economy is stronger than politics ultimately, and maybe that's what's going to happen here as well. So now we have some time for questions, do we? Yeah. All right. So I think we don't want to ask about specific investments, right, Kat?
That's right, we don't
Yeah.
want to ask about, no fist fighting, no politics, if we can help that.
And
Also,
no Trump question.
no Trump questions. So we're going to run over a little bit, so those of you that need to leave, please do so as quietly and as inconspicuously as possible, and for the rest of you, we'll be here for about another 10 minutes. So,
Okay,
question.
I have
Oh,
more.
Thank
you.
you.
Yes, thank
Okay.
you. What's going to be the influence of the breakdown of the free trade agreements, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is broken down, and possibly the NAFTA they're talking about, and even in the European countries, they say the group of 20 has agreed to have more protectionist policies. What will that influence of that be? The protectionist, more protectionist on trade. What will that? How will that affect our markets?
Well, I can say a few words on it, so here's an interesting thing. So let's talk about NAFTA first of all, right? Because we're in Mexico, and so one of the things that President Trump is talking about is certainly modifying NAFTA because his whole policy is to be more America-centric. Possibly doing away with it. I doubt we're going to see it done away with. But let's think about what if NAFTA went away. If NAFTA went away, then what happens is we go back to what are called WTO rules, World Trade Organization rules. And what WTO rules will, in essence, mean is higher taxes on cross-border trade between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada, the U.S., because NAFTA gives a favorable tax treatment to this kind of movement right now. Now, here's the thing. Who is this going to hurt? Let's think about this. Is it going to hurt Mexico? Well, it's going to impose a higher tax on Mexican goods going across the border, maybe 25%. Trump's even talking about a 35% tax. However, since the election, the peso has depreciated by about that much. So for the Mexicans, they're going to be exporting it at basically the same price. They'll have higher taxes, but the peso has fallen. So for them, it's probably not going to make that much of a difference. But the flip side of that is, what about the American farmers and all the people from Texas who are importing into the States? U.S. dollar has gone up by 20%, and now there's going to be a bigger tax on top of that. So, this policy would ultimately hurt the people exporting to Mexico, the farmers, and, it's not such a big market, but it is a substantial market. And it's 6% of Texas GDP goes to Mexico, I read somewhere. And so that's the people that it's going to hurt. Those are the people who voted for Trump, right? And that's what these people don't understand. And I don't know if you have something to say about Trans-Pacific Partnership, but
I think I concur about not only in agriculture, automobiles, and so on and so forth. Now, it is interesting to note that the first head of state that officially met Trump was the British Prime Minister, an official visit. Apparently, UK was going to be at the bottom of the barrel, and number one. Now, America is already there. I wish actually Trump would meet immediately with Putin and put a lot of things to rest, and where things can move forward. I don't think Putin is, well, he's not a nice guy, but it is in the interest of the United States to actually sit down with him and, just like Bush said one day, look in his eyes and see if we can do business with him, and move on.
You speak a lot about the equity markets. Would you make a few comments regarding bond markets, both corporate and municipal?
Sure. So bond markets, ultimately bond investments depend on the level of interest rates. Right? Interest rates go up, bond prices go down. That is a fact of life. It's not speculation. I think it's pretty clear where interest rates are heading. They're heading higher, at least in the States, from a very low base. So still very low. So if you, some of you are lucky enough to be locked into annuities you bought years ago, and I've seen some, as a registered investment advisor, we don't deal in variable annuities especially, and we've always kind of disdained those products. But I have to say that if you're now getting a 6% rate of return in some of these annuities at a time where you get nothing in the bank, it's not a bad deal. So what happens in the bond market, again, I see interest rates going up. I see interest rates going up very slowly. That's going to be negative for bond prices. If you hold actual bonds, something with a maturity date, you know what you're going to get, right? Barring default, at least you know what you're going to get. The problem is really with bond funds, because most people are invested in bond funds. And there's no bottom to a bond fund. Because what a bond fund does is, let's say you have an intermediate term bond fund which is full of, say, 7-year bonds. Well, it's full of 7-year bonds forever, because that money has to be reinvested. So whoever the manager is, he keeps buying 7-year bonds, whatever. So when interest rates go up, there's really no bottom to this kind of investment. It's not going to fall off a cliff, but you kind of have this gradual decline in the price. So you really need to think about whether the yield you're getting from those products will offset that possible decline. Now the other aspect is, if that's, say, 50% of your portfolio and the other 50% is in stocks, then there should be some balancing, and there should be some diversification. So maybe you're okay with that. But that's my perspective
Yeah,
on.
there's a lot of other questions I think
Yeah.
we're trying to answer in a short period of time.
Thank you very much. I'm very impressed with what you had to say. And the thing that I was most concerned about, what's happened in Mexico, but I'm hearing some of that from you too. And so rather than go into any more detail, I want to thank you very much. I also want to say that this morning when I read the Washington Post, there are now Republican senators who are opposing Trump and saying he is not acceptable, and they're starting to come out against him. So there is some
I
hope.
have to stop. You can't talk politics.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You guys work well together. Here's a $50,000 question. Where do you keep your money?
Well, for me, it's easy. So I invest along with my clients. Because just from a compliance perspective, that's the easiest thing to do. But also, I mean, why would I buy something for my clients I don't believe in personally? Now, obviously, I have a different profile from somebody who's retired, for example. I'm still working, right? So my investments tend to be more aggressive than probably the average client. But we have different categories. Just like most advisors, there's a less risky category, there's a more risky category. And in general, whatever I put into my clients' accounts, I also have it in my account. Now, I also run my own business, so a lot of my money is tied up in that. My wife works for Apple. Thanks to her, we have a lot of Apple stock. That's doing well. So, that's the way my investments are, basically. But one thing I'm not invested in, and partly to do with my profile, is I'm not invested in bonds. I would rather have dividend-paying investments now than bonds. But I'm not retired, and I don't need the income either, so.
And I concur with that, pretty much with the same profile. As a registered investment advisor, we're not stockbrokers, and we have a fiduciary duty to our clients. That's extremely important. We put our clients' interest first. So I would not buy something for a client if it was not good enough for me. It's definitely not good enough for my client, or our client.
Here in the back.
Yeah, thank you. You said that if Trump doesn't deliver on his, if he can't do anything, then in October you expect a correction. Now, will that be international? Like, if we're invested in China, say, will that be impacted as well? Or only you're talking about the Dow and the...
Well, China's economy has changed drastically for the past 15 years, for the past 40, but the past 15 years even more so. 10 years ago, you looked at China exporting 1/3 of its economy, of its GDP, the United States being the first buyer. And at the same time, China still is, but is a net seller now of treasuries. So whatever the government spends, China is there to buy it. They're no longer doing that. They're net sellers of the U.S. treasuries, because China's profile is changing very rapidly, not only being the second economy in the world. What they're doing is they're only now exporting 22% of their GDP. What does that mean? It means you have a growing middle class. So even though it stays communist, quote-unquote, country, they're opening up their doors. They're doing multiple deals with Russia at this point, and they want to make sure that the United States does not remain the engine of the world, because there's increased political risk. So again, when I said there may be a correction, if I had the crystal ball, I would be on the yacht somewhere in the Caribbean. My best guess, and I guess it's a guess, or an indicative guess, is there is increased risk as we go through the summer. So there is also, as you mentioned, North Korea can go crazy, but that's something that, again, try the crystal ball. Hope that answered your question.
Yeah, sorry, let me just say a quick thing about that. The other thing is that there's this phenomena where the stock market, let's say, and I hate to keep coming back to the stock market, but the stock market does better from November to April than from April to November. And it especially, you look at the financial crisis, a lot of them have been in October kind of thing, right? So that's really the time, all these things are going to kind of come together. That's the other reason why we're mentioning this as well.
Okay, this will be the last question. They're going to stay here and hang out, and you can come up and talk to them. So if you have a question, you can come and see them. Yes?
Would you care to comment on global currency reset and the Federal Reserve notes versus U.S. Treasury notes?
I don't know about the federal notes versus treasury
We
notes.
would love to come back next year if we're invited.
Yeah.
And this is the full topic. The currency market, as you may know, is actually larger than the bond and stock market combined. I don't even want to get involved. We'll be here for an hour.
I will say one thing about that. It's that currency markets usually, when times are normal, depend on the relative level of interest rates between two countries. When the interest rate goes up in one country, that tends to also increase the value of that currency because money flows to the higher interest rate country, basically, right? So all other things being equal, if interest rates are going up in the States, but they're not going up in Europe, you would expect the dollar to strengthen versus the euro, for example, which has happened over the last couple of years. But then you get these shocks to the system as well, like elections and so on and so forth, which have different aspects to that. But ultimately, I mean, if you're looking at currency movements and you're looking at longer term, then look at the interest rates, the relative interest rates.
I have to say, second part of the question, I have to add this. Both have good faith of the U.S. government. If you believe in the U.S. government, you believe in that piece of paper, whether it's a U.S. note or emitted by the Fed.
Thank you.
Please turn on your cell phones if you'd like to or don't. Stack your chairs, pick up your coffee cups. We'd appreciate your help. And if you can take your conversations outside, then we can close up as quickly as we can. We look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much.